All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Wilson. I work at the Illinois State Water Survey. So you're here for a webinar entitled, Is My Well Water Safe to Drink? Common Questions About Private Wells. This is we do a monthly webinar as part of our private well class program. We're at the State Water Survey, which is at the University of Illinois. And this program is a partnership with the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, RCAP, and it's funded through US EPA. It's a technical assistance and training grant program to help private well owners. And so we have a number of partners, including NEHA, and working with them, they provide a version of our class, which we have a 10-lesson class I'll talk about later, that is available also on NEHA's website for CEUs for sanitarians. And as well, I'm not forwarding here. There we go. If you're on the webinar today and you're a sanitarian who wants CEUs from NEHA, just a little bit about the guidelines for that. You can only get credit for this class, this particular one. It's got the same core content once every 2 years in your credentialing cycle. So as an example, if your credentialing cycle ends at the end of this month, then you could take this again anytime after February 1st for the next 2 years for your next cycle. But if you're near the end and you participated in the one in May 15th, 2018, down there in the lower right corner, then you can't get credit for this class again. So I just want to point that out to everyone. And if you have questions, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. And one thing I will say is, this program is really geared towards well owners and so and those who serve them. So hopefully there's information here. We got a lot of questions as well, and we'll see, as we get through those. So today, again, my name is Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist. I work a lot on applied research projects and educational type efforts with well owners around the state. And with us today also is Katie Buckley. You just heard her voice. She's an outreach specialist here at the Water Survey, and she's going to take your questions that you might put into the question box or the chat box today. And also Dan Webb, who manages our public service lab, which the Water Survey is fortunate to have a public service lab that provides sampling to private well owners. Until 2008, it was a free service for inorganics and metals, and now there's this fee related to that, and it's for folks who live in Illinois. And so anything today related to treatment and water quality, Dan is our expert. I won't claim to have any expertise there, not much. So, so let's get started. This program is part of a national effort by RCAP, as I mentioned, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, to support private well owners from the standpoint of the more folks understand their wells, the better they are at protecting both their well water and the source water, the aquifers that supply everyone's wells with water in the first place. And so these materials are meant to supplement the class that we developed. It's a 10-lesson online class that walks a well owner through what it means to be a well owner, what things they should know, and provides a lot of background information to help them understand what type of well they have and some of those things. So today we're going to talk about well sampling and treatment type issues and is your water safe? And at the end, there'll also be time for follow-up questions. I want to mention that everyone had an opportunity to ask questions when they signed up for this webinar, and we got a bunch. So we will answer some of those, and some of those we've lumped together with a number of questions that were similar with slides towards the end of the webinar. But if you have any questions today that come up as we go through the material or you forgot to ask, you can go to the question or chat box on your GoToWebinar window and add them there, and Katie's going to monitor that, and we'll do that at the very end. So we plan to be here an hour and a half, but it could last longer or be a little shorter depending on how many questions we get. But we'll do our best to answer them or get your information so that we can send you information later. One thing I almost forgot, there's also a handout section on the GoToWebinar screen that lists the CE attendance, the worksheet for today, and the agenda for today. And you can download those, and we can also provide you with, if you're looking for CEUs, a PDF version of these slides at the end. I'm going to take 1 second because my door isn't quite shut, so hang on just for 1 second. I usually forget something. Hopefully that's the only thing today. All right, so a little bit about RCAP, and they're really important to bring up here for everyone, whether you're a well owner or whether you're a well professional or someone who works with well owners. They're made up of 6 regional affiliates, so that's why it's called a partnership, and they're listed here, and these are the regions they represent. So you may know them under a different name like Communities Unlimited in Arkansas or Texas, or RCAC, the Rural Assistance Community Corporation, that's based out of California and covers the western states. The reason they're an important partner and why you need to know who they are is they're the boots on the ground part of this program. You know, we sit at the University of Illinois, we develop materials and provide support, but RCAP has staff in every state, over 200 technical assistance providers. Many of them are licensed water or wastewater operators. Some are private well experts or sanitarians, and they're implementing the part of this private well program that EPA funds them to do with boots on the ground, if you will, helping well owners directly and providing workshops and trainings for both well owners and well professionals. So if you are a well owner and you're interested in finding who your representative or person is in your state, let us know, and we'll get you in touch with them. And the same if you're with the health department or extension, or if you're interested in having a workshop put on, these folks can help you set that up and provide some of the material, maybe even find the speakers for you, that sort of thing. So, and the other reason is one of the biggest parts of our program is doing this private well or spring assessment. We developed this assessment tool. It's got, I think, maybe 16 or 18 sections. It's meant to be a way for a professional who understands wells to sit down with a well owner and explain all the details and look at all the details related to the well. It goes over a number of topics. Type of pipes you have in your house, what's near your well. It's a site assessment. It's a way to spend an hour or two with someone who understands well and water quality issues and have them fill this out, and it's something that a well owner can keep. It's really like a summary of everything you need to know related to your well. If there's a log, you can attach it, all those sorts of things. So for those of you who are familiar with sanitary surveys that are conducted for community water supplies, it's really like a sanitary survey for a private well. It's a vulnerability assessment. It's to look at what might be wrong, what might be an issue, or what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong as a well owner. It's also an opportunity then to go through those questions, and there's several hundred questions in the end, or boxes to fill out, which gives the well owner a chance to ask, hey, why do you need to know this? Or, what's the point of understanding if I have backflow, for instance? So it's an opportunity then to promote best practices, engage a well owner, and encourage them to communicate with like their local health department and extension, so that they understand their well better and can learn more. And it's, our job, my mission, or our mission for the private well class, is to help raise awareness and educate well owners about their wells and kind of raise that level of knowledge around the country. There's 17 to 18 million private wells in use in the country, 45 million people or so, and that's a lot of people using well water. And some have a lot of wherewithal and really understand their wells very well, and there's others who really don't understand what it means to be a well owner and the responsibilities they have. So that's our job, is to try to help bridge that gap. So RCAP has done over 1,800 of these assessments already around the country. And in some cases, they work with a local or state health agency, or for instance, in one state, the health department doesn't have the staff to go out and help well owners when they have a real critical problem, to go visit the site and do all those things. So they're working with RCAP in that state to actually go perform those assessments to help those people out when they have a real issue. They've also done a bunch of workshops around the country to teach others how to use the assessment tool, and most of those are health professionals. And so, yeah, as I said, if you are interested in any of those things, let us know. It's all free. Everything, this is a federally funded program, and that's really actually probably the best thing about all of this is we can offer all the support and help at no cost to the well owner or to the health department for putting these things on. Okay, so a little bit about us. So the State Water Survey, a lot of folks haven't heard of us, even in Illinois, because every state has a state geological survey and a state natural history survey, but Illinois is the only state that has a water survey as an additional agency, if you will. And they were formed in the 1890s because of outbreaks of cholera and typhoid, and wanted to look at, the state legislator wanted a department, if you will, at the time, to look at those issues. And the work that the Water Survey did early on in the 1890s and early 1900s became the basis for, we house all the state's well logs. We have a public service lab that has literally 40 or 50,000 water samples from around the state, and we provide a lot of support to communities and well owners and others, even groups like FEMA and USDA and other folks like that, related to groundwater, surface water, and atmospheric sciences. So as an example, this is from our well records. We're doing a little house cleaning currently, looking at digitizing all the old paper records we have. And this is Pana, Illinois, a small town in south central Illinois. In 1916, they had a typhoid outbreak. And the Water Survey investigated that. These are all the homes that had typhoid in them. And you can see the little arrows there that says Pana Ice Cream Company. They finally determined that it was the Pana Ice Cream Company that was causing the issue. And so it's just one example. We've got records going back, as I said, well over 100 years of the type of work we do. We're not well known, especially outside of the state. Most of our work's been within Illinois. But we have a lot of expertise and provide a lot of support. And so if you have questions, we have a groundwater section that I'm in that can support any issues you might have. So as far as being a private well owner, here's the things you really need to understand. Private wells aren't regulated. Now, there are a few areas where that's not true, but I mean very few, very small areas. You're responsible to make sure your water's safe to drink and the system's maintained. So you're the water operator for a very small water system is the bottom line. And so that's actually a lot of responsibility for you and your to take care of your family and anyone who might drink the water from your well. And well water can taste great. It looks safe. It's odorless, colorless, has no taste. That doesn't mean that it is. Some of the most common contaminants like arsenic, you're not going to see in your water. You're not going to taste it, but we know it's a health hazard. So I grew up in an old dug well, 14 feet deep, that my grandpa hand dug in 1933. And after I went to college and came back home, I couldn't drink our water anymore. It made me sick. So my body had gotten used to it as I was growing up, but there was stuff in it, and it was unsafe. It was in a pasture. It was in a ravine where water could run in from the surface. So those things do matter, and making sure your well's protected matters. Now I live in the Champaign-Urbana community. I pay $40 or $50 a month, and that cost for every home in our area is probably 40 or 50,000 homes here. Pays for a licensed operator, maintaining all the infrastructure, and all the testing that goes into making sure that when I turn on my tap, I know the water's safe to drink. And as a well owner, that's your responsibility. And there's only a few ways you can do that. You have to maintain it, you have to test it, and you have to take care of the infrastructure, just like a community would, just on your own scale. Okay, so it's really all about being aware. A lot of well owners, we do a septic webinar every July, and I must have 20 people ask, how do I find my septic tank? Now, to me, that says that you're not, if you're asking that question, then you're not taking care of your system, because your septic tank, though it's not part of your well or your water system, can be a critical player in whether or not your well gets contaminated. And not maintaining it makes the issue there more likely. For one, you can have those things get clogged up, and then you start seeing that come to the surface and all those sorts of things. So you need to understand your entire system. You need to understand your well log, where your water's coming from. It matters if it's 23 feet deep versus 300 feet deep. whether it's a bedrock well or sand and gravel well, all those things matter and will help you understand what level of risk you might have, as well as your surroundings. So it's really simple to call your either local health agency or maybe your state, like Geological Survey or DNR, whatever the group may be. If you have naturally occurring contaminants like arsenic or uranium or something like that in your aquifers that your water comes from, they're going to know it. And so we know what areas of the state in Illinois have arsenic and which areas don't, which aquifers may have a problem with it and may not. And so hopefully going through this and going through our class helps you understand how to ask better questions and understand that there's a lot of local sources of information that can help you. And lastly, you have to sample your well. If you're not doing that, then you really don't know. Groundwater can be perfectly safe. A lot of folks use it and never have any problems. But if you're not sampling to ensure that's the case, you really have no idea, no confidence in what you're drinking. So as far as testing goes, there's always a lot of questions about testing. It's kind of the biggest issue. Some people test once, maybe 20 years ago, and they think it's fine. And we'll get through what our recommendations are. But it's a big hill to climb over, and that's probably part of the reason why some people haven't tested, because there's just a lot of things to know when you go into that. Where do I collect it? How do I collect it? What should I test for? How often? All these things matter. And so we're going to walk through some of this and some of the best practices anyway that we believe that folks should follow. So as far as collecting the sample, there's a number of ways to do this, but you should always collect one from your kitchen sink. And the thing to note is water from different faucets or different taps could have different water quality because of the piping in your home, the treatment you might have. And so this first bullet here says the water in your kitchen sink could be chemically different from the water in an outside tap. I'll show you an example of that in a second, I think. But your outside tap may be connected directly to a line from your well, where the water at your kitchen sink may go through a filter or a softener or even, other things, an RO unit or something else. It may be sitting in lead pipes or in copper pipes. And so depending on your water quality, those things all can change the chemistry. Or in your pressure tank, it may be an air water pressure tank. So when water is exposed to air, a lot of dissolved things can precipitate or oxidize to precipitate sediment, things like that. So with our lab, and what Dan does is we always, when a well owner calls us and asks about collecting samples, we usually try to collect two, one from a kitchen sink and one from an outside tap that's for any kind of treatment or household plumbing. And part of that reason is because we're a research-based agency. I want to know as a groundwater hydrologist what the water quality is in the aquifer as much as I want to know what the drinking water quality is in the home. And this gives us an opportunity to do that. So the bottom line is there's a lot of things that can affect your well water and your drinking water. You could have lead pipes. If your piping's before 1986, it certainly has a lot of lead solder unless it's PVC. And then, treatment devices obviously change the chemistry of the water. So when you go to a lab, they should be able to provide you detailed instructions, tell you if you need to ice it, how soon it needs to be returned, and give you all the information you need if they're doing their job. So what do you test for? And, there's a set thing we hear a lot about. The bottom bullet here says sample for coliform bacteria and nitrate annually, and they indicate a pathway to your well. Well, they're so ubiquitous at the surface in our environment that if you have those at high levels in your well, that likely means there's a source near the surface that can get in your well. And that just means your well's at more risk, because that means if somebody spilled a chemical near your well, it might be able to get in there, versus a well that doesn't show those things. It means that it's probably properly sealed and properly protected near the surface so that surface constituents aren't getting in your well. But as far as exactly what to test for, it really depends on your situation, how deep your well is, what formation you're coming from. Again, you can call, in Illinois, you can call us, or in another state, you can call your DNR or DEQ or a Geological Survey and find out areas where there might be naturally occurring constituents like arsenic or uranium. And if they're known to be in that area, then you definitely would want to test for them as well. In most cases, your county or local health department are going to have that information. I know here in Illinois, we don't have local health districts like you do out east. We have county health departments and then our state health department that oversees that program. And our counties know if I call, a certain county and they can tell me if they have, that one of their aquifers has anything in it just because they've seen enough samples from those areas. So lean on those people is the bottom line. You can ask them for recommendations on what to test for, and they're probably much more equipped to tell you what to test for than I am sitting here at the University of Illinois. Yeah, and again, another group you could reach out to is your county co-op extension folks. They may have, some states vary. In some states, there are active private well programs related to co-op extension, and other states that aren't. And so, but it's worth a phone call or an email to find out. Just some examples. The other thing is you need to be inquisitive. Go online, look at your state health department, your state, the department that regulates community water supplies. This is the state of Rhode Island. All those little dots that are all through there are where there used to be orchards. Rhode Island's a pretty small state. I think it's about 30 by 20 miles. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong. So arsenic was a heavily used pesticide for a long time. So those areas, there's certainly soil contamination with arsenic. In some cases where there might be shallow groundwater that could be contaminated too. The reason I show this slide though is because that big splotch in the middle is beryllium. So Rhode Island's unique in that it has this area of high beryllium in their groundwater. I had never heard of beryllium as a regulated contaminant. So when I saw this on their website a number of years ago, I looked it up, and sure enough, the Safe Drinking Water Act has a regulation for beryllium because it does have detrimental health effects that every community has to meet. It's not that common in the environment. We don't see high beryllium in very many places, and so Rhode Island just happens to be a unique location. But the point is, we found it because we looked, and so it's worth your time as a well owner to do the same, depending on what state you live in. And other examples, Massachusetts has this website where you can type in your address and it'll tell you if you're at risk of arsenic or uranium. There's a lot in the bedrock aquifers there, so they say if you have a bedrock well, here's something you probably want to consider. So it's a helpful tool. They're trying to help the citizens of their state learn more about their groundwater and to protect their health. And lastly, Wisconsin DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, is the regulated entity in the state of Wisconsin. They've taken all their private well samples and worked with the Center for Watershed Science and Education at Stevens Point and developed this online tool. So I got online. It's a GIS-based application. I clicked on arsenic to display by county, and it shows me this data. Where the counties are clear, that means there's no results. In one county, none was detected. But you can see here that the arsenic standard is 10 micrograms per liter, which is parts per billion. And you can see there are 3 counties there down by Green Bay where it's red, which means the average sample was over 21, which is twice the health standard. So understanding those things matters for a lot of reasons. 1, if you live there. 2, if you want to move there. Or just knowing what kind of, and if you're an educator or a health official, it helps you understand what risks there might have. And you could I could have looked at other things here too. I'm really showing this as an example. This is one of the better sites out there. And but more states are developing these tools, and so we expect eventually that most people will be able to see at least aggregated data on their health effects. And I probably should mention here a few states have made sampling mandatory during a property transfer, and so the leader in that respect is New Jersey. They passed a law over 20 years ago that requires every home or property sold with a private well to be tested for a wide range of constituents. Their state lab does the sampling, and the buyer and the seller have to agree on who pays for it, and they're the only ones that get to see the results. But because of that, New Jersey has several 100,000 research quality water samples of their groundwater and their wells in the state. So their maps are very detailed. They don't show any individual data, but they know where there's arsenic or where there's other kinds of problems. It's helped them identify a lot of industrial issues. It's just an amazing data set for the state of New Jersey. And it's a way for you as a well owner to understand what things you might want to test for as well. So what we recommend, and again, you need to remember that we're trying to reach a national audience, so we've made this fairly generic, if you will. But here's what we recommend. Coliform nitrate annually, and then if you haven't done it before initially, all the things that are listed here for different reasons, they give you a good background chemistry of your water to understand what might be going on, how hard it is. If you do have, galvanized pipes in your home, a lot of older homes do, or lead pipes, then you should sample for those things. But again, bottom line is this is your health, and it's important, and I'm not a health professional, and so we recommend that you talk to your local or state health department about what they recommend for your area, and they may have other things that they think you should sample for. So, but with this information, there are a lot of folks who, like Dan, who runs our lab, can look at this and say, give you a good general idea of what kind of water quality you might have. And some things can change easily. Other things like arsenic in a deeper aquifer, I've got monitoring wells that we've monitored for almost 30 years. And the arsenic level in those, a few of them that are, in the 40s, let's say, stay near the 40s all the time. It's not like it's very variable because groundwater moves slowly, especially in deeper aquifers. And again, it really depends on your unique individual well situation, and that's why you need to understand it. So, for example, here's a well sample from our lab. This first one here is, so there's 3 samples that I'm going to show you. The first one is without any treatment. So this is from an outside spigot. So this is really the groundwater quality. And you can see the hardness down on the bottom right is 351. The pH is 8.02. And the other one that's interesting here is the sodium level is 25.9. It's in the kind of the upper left. So after that's ran through a filter and a softener, you can see the sodium jumped from 25.9 to 198. So they're using regular softener salt. And what that's done is it's reduced the hardness to less than 1, which is what its job is as a softener. But it's also increased the sodium in the drinking water to, almost 8 times what it was. And for a few people that might matter. Those of you that are health professionals probably deal a lot with folks that need to be on low sodium diets. And so it's just one example of an unintended consequence of, you're softening your water because that makes everything else better, but you need to be aware of what that can mean. And then this person added an RO unit to their well. And so you can see here, once reverse osmosis, it takes out most things. Now, sometimes not as well, depending on the chemistry, as like I know for arsenic, there's 2 forms of arsenic, and if it's in the wrong form, RO doesn't work as well. And so you really need to understand those or have a professional help you with those things. But all those less than signs show you that it's well below our detection limit for a lot of things. And so RO does, its job as well, if you will. But it's just interesting how treatment works and what it can mean. And it's thought it was worth everyone taking a look. So, so when do you test your well? So annually, like we said before, and every 3 to 5 years for those things. But then anytime the well's opened, anytime there's maintenance done, or any kind of emergency response event. And this was that's a melted well cap and melted wiring from a forest fire at a home that was in the country or in a forested area. And so, there are recommendations. If you live in an area where you could have a forest fire, the biggest problem here is not only did it probably ruin the well cap and the wiring, but when those wires melt together, if you haven't got the power off to that thing, it's probably going to run your pump and eventually burn it up. And so you're going to be replacing the pump as well. So, there's a lot of things to consider when you're a well owner, but the only time you should test is when your well's open in some way, or there's some adverse event like this that's happened. that might have affected it. And as far as disinfecting your well, it says here after disinfecting. So if you've had to disinfect your well because you've had a positive coliform hit, then obviously after the chlorine's all out of the system, and before you really want to drink that, you should test again to make sure that the disinfection worked, because there certainly are cases where it might not have. Where to get it analyzed? Well, every state accredits labs, and so you should try to use one on your state's list. If you look at, for any state, if you Google their primacy agency, that is the regulatory agency in the state that has to regulate community water supplies, like in Illinois, that's the Illinois EPA. In Wisconsin, that's Wisconsin DNR. In Michigan, it's the Department of Environmental Quality. It varies from state to state, but they all have one mission, and that is to ensure that the water being served to the public and community water supplies is safe. They have a list of labs. You can also go to the US EPA website and search for accredited labs or a lab certification program, and you can get to a map that you can click on and get to a list in each state of all the accredited labs. And we recommend using a lab that meets the EPA requirements for accreditation and they're certified, only because if they're not, then there's, what that does is it means that lab has went through a process and proven to their state that the methods they follow, the procedures they follow, and the sample results they get can be repeated and to a certain criteria. So that said, the U of I, our lab here that Dan runs, used to be accredited, and the cost for doing that became extensive. We follow all the EPA protocols. We do all the duplicates and blanks and everything else you need to do to be accredited. We just don't have the manpower for all the paperwork that's required these days, and so we're not accredited. And in that case, what we would tell everyone, and there's a number of labs like that. Virginia Tech has one, Texas A&M, and I'm sure there's others at other universities. That's more of a, it's not a defendable sample, if you will, in court because we're not certified, but it's certainly a good way to go is to find out about your well water. And if you really had a concern, then you could go to a certified lab later. But the important thing here is a good lab is going to be able to give you detailed instructions, answer any questions you have, and let you know what the procedure is. If it's a nitrate sample, how soon it's got to be back, or a bacteria sample, so that it can be sampled within a window that meets the criteria for that analysis. And you should ask questions until you're satisfied, until you're really clear on what you're going to try to do. And if that lab can't do that, and they don't have, we've run across folks who said, well, I called the lab and they told me I should know what I want to test for. Well, we've done a lot to work with labs and with the Association of Public Health Laboratories to educate their labs on the fact that, well owners may not know those answers, and they're looking to the lab to be that expert, and so they need to have that expertise. And so my advice is if you talk to a lab and they can't give you good answers, find a different lab because it's important that you're working with someone you feel comfortable with and someone that, clearly has the expertise to take care of your needs, if you will. So, labs usually provide the bottles and all the instructions and, the how to get them back and all those things. So it should be a good experience is the bottom line. As far as interpreting results, now there are websites out there and documents that list what the standards are and all those things. But the first thing we would recommend you do is go to your local health department and ask them to review your results with you. They're the health experts, and they're going to know if there's something in your water that is really a problem. I would also use one of those sites. There's one I'm going to show you in a second that's really good. It was developed by the state of New Hampshire. And two other points, if you do find something in your well, especially if it's really off the charts and seems to qualified folks you talk to like it really shouldn't be there, then maybe resample. Sometimes labs make mistakes as well. And so, there's areas in Illinois where we have arsenic that's probably in the 10s to 200s. But if a sample came back and said it was 2,000 or 3,000, my first thought would be that the lab didn't do the dilution correctly or something like that. Whereas there are places, like in one of the aquifers in Wisconsin, a deep bedrock aquifer, where you could have 3,000 for an arsenic result. So, but you're not expected to know that. It's just if it's high or if there's something that doesn't seem right, it's always good to resample to confirm, just because there could be mistakes. And especially on the bacteria side, you know, there's a lot of ways to contaminate a sample bottle. And there's even classes taught to water operators who are licensed to collect samples every month on how to collect their bacteria samples so that they don't contaminate the bottle or the sample from some other source. And so if you have the lab that you use gives you a positive or a negative for an E. coli or coliform test, it's certainly worth testing it again to see, because sometimes that could have been the way that the sample was collected or something like that. So, and if you do have an E. coli test performed, then you need to disinfect your well. And I said chlorinate here, but you need to disinfect, and that's typically how it's done before anybody drinks it. So this is the tool I was mentioning. The New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services developed this Be Well Informed guide, and it's for residents in the state of New Hampshire, but anybody can use it. It asks you, you know, what city you live in or what local health district you're in, but one of the answers is you're not anonymous, and so anyone can use it. And it's they've made this code available. Other states are starting to build their own sites to use it as well. It's a really well done tool. And so, you know, down at the bottom here it says enter your well water results. So you click on the green button, and it takes you to a page where you can enter your results. So I typed in 15. And then it has a drop down for units. And the reason I want to bring that up is when you get a lab sample result, they may all be in milligrams per liter. So if this sample were in milligrams per liter and not micrograms per liter, it would be 0.015 instead of 15 or and so that's a much different animal. When you hear somebody say, oh, the arsenic standard's 10, and they don't put the units on it, or somebody doesn't understand the units, they see 0.015 and they're like, thank goodness, I don't have anything in my well. Well, if it's in milligrams per liter, that means it's actually 15 parts per billion. And so this tool actually, I like it because some labs report in different units for different constituents. You've got a drop down on what it's likely to be. You can make sure you click on the one that matches what's written on your report, versus some of the other ones require you to actually convert it yourself. We have, for our private well class, we have a pre-test that people can take to see how much they already know about their wells. One of the questions is a conversion from, I think it's from milligrams per liter to ppb, and only 27% of about 4,000 people have got that right. So units are an issue, and they can really scare you when they don't need to, or they may lead you to believe that you're safe when you're not. And so it's a really important issue as a well owner to understand what those units mean. So once you've hit submit, it tells you, so yeah, we've got a red X here saying arsenic is 15, which is 0.015 milligrams per liter, and the standard is officially 0.01, which is 0.01 milligrams per liter, which is 10 micrograms per liter, sorry. And it also gives you an idea of what kind of treatment you might want to use. So really for arsenic, there are two types of home units, either an absorptive media, which is like a cartridge that can go on your kitchen sink, or a point of use RO system, which typically can go under the sink if it's just for the kitchen tap, and you know, it removes arsenic. So there's a lot of good material here. It kind of gives you some idea of what you're looking at whenever you have your results, and then it even goes down and talks about what type of equipment. And so quickly on treatment equipment, you want to be careful what you buy, that it's supposed to do what that it does what it's supposed to do. And one of the ways to ensure that is to make sure it meets an NSF ANSI standard. And so in this case, if you look at the bottom gray box, it says NSF standard 53 is for absorptive media filter systems. So when you go out to look at some kind of cartridge filter to see if it removes arsenic, it should say meets NSF standard 53, NSF ANSI standard 53. If it doesn't, then you have no guarantee that it actually works no matter what it says on the box. And the same if it's an RO unit, it should say it meets NSF standard 58. for certified. That means that, you know, the national, that NSF or the Water Quality Association or Underwriters Labs, UL, one of those 3 certifying groups have tested this equipment at a given concentration of arsenic, and it actually removed what it was supposed to. So it's worth it. Usually those kind of treatment devices cost more, but if you don't buy one that's certified, it may not actually work at all. And so it's really important to understand that.
Hey, Steve?
So, yeah.
Hey, I just want to make a point while you were there.
Oh, good. Don't, go ahead.
Like Steve said, he mentioned some of the certifying agencies like Water Quality Association and NSF. I think both those places, I'm not overly familiar with the websites too much, but they both have some search engines. You can look up your devices and they can help you with that, the different certification standards, or you can also type in what you're trying to remove, and I think they can help guide you to that. Yeah,
I forgot it. Thank you. Yeah, I think, and that might be on UL's website, but I don't remember which one.
So, yeah, not overly familiar with them, but yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of information hopefully they have to help you understand that as well. Thanks, Dan. So as far as, again, what I said earlier about interpreting results, those tools, like the one we just went through, is really just a guide, and it's for typical water. It's really important that you take your sample results to someone who's qualified, either your local health department or even maybe your doctor, if there's any kind of concern. So, health professionals are there to help you understand and keep you safe. You should lean on them, and, they have a lot of good information. So now, this last bullet says they cannot tell you to stop drinking your water or condemn your well. They can only recommend it. That's true in about 98% of the country. There are a few local jurisdictions, a couple counties, and a number of states that have passed their own rules that do require you to add equipment to make the water safe to drink or meet the Safe Drinking Water Act standards. But you can find that out by talking to your local health agency. And I know I mentioned Rhode Island New Jersey has a testing law, but they don't tell you what to do with that. They just make sure you're informed about what's in the water. The one state that has added a stricter law is Rhode Island. Their law says that with any property transfer, you have to have the well tested. And they've tied that result to the building inspector who has to inspect the property before it's sold. And they can use adverse water quality as a reason to condemn the property if you don't add treatment to mediate that problem. So if you had high arsenic, they would expect you to add treatment to remove it before the property could sell. And but that's the only state that does anything like that, and that's during a property transfer. Okay. As far as well construction, honestly, 90% of the problems that people have with their wells are because of old wells or poor well construction. The well construction codes have only been around for 30 or 40 years, and in some states much less than that. And in 2 states, there still is no well construction code. So without those rules to help ensure that wells are put in properly, just like the well I grew up on, my grandpa hand dug it. He put it in a ravine right where a little stream, a slough was running through, so that it would always be water, not understanding the water quality implications of that. So we still have wells that are in pits, which are both dangerous and can have water in them, which, in a colder climate, you put a well in a pit so that it was below the frost line, so in the winter your well and your pipes didn't freeze. Now today we have pitless adapters for those areas, so that you can have your well casing up to the surface, but many are still in use today, as are old hand-dug wells, like the one I grew up on, is still being used. So it's important to understand that if you have a well that has significant challenges and isn't protective from surface contamination, it's really something you need to fix if you can. So as examples here, and so the Washington State Department of Ecology is the state agency in Washington State that regulates well construction and licenses drillers. So they have a blog. It's really really do a good job. And they put this picture up about a woman who was out in her well house, and she fell in this well, and it killed her. And you can see here there's it's an old corrugated pipe for the well casing. The pump's sitting up here at the surface, so it's a shallow well. But you can see what looks like there used to be more of a board there, and that concrete brick was there to cover that hole. There's a broom in the corner, and it looks like insulation that's laying all around. There's probably mice in there, everything else that can fall in that well. The bottom line is this is just a poor example of a well that you'd want to drink from. And this other well with the dead animal in it, that's a dead goat, was out in the country in southern Illinois. And yeah, this poor goat fell in there, and no one knew it, and because it was wide open. And it was out in an area where no one thought anything could happen. And yeah, we've had, I've run across about anything you can run across, I think, in a well. And it's really amazing how people don't realize snakes, rats, rabbits, a lot of things, and they fall in your well, they're gonna eventually die, and they're gonna contaminate the water. So it's really important to make sure your well's protected and you know, really watertight near the surface if it can be. So what do you do with these wells? You need to bring them up to code if you can. And you know, sometimes that's really expensive. It may even be better just to put in a new well. But if you have a well in a pit, extend the pipe up to land surface and then fill that in with clay and using a pitless adapter if you need to. But talk to, you know, a well expert or a contractor, or even, you know, extension, or in a lot of county or local health departments, they have, especially if they are used to looking at new wells as part of, you know, in Illinois, our county health departments have to inspect every new well that's drilled. So they, you know, just by doing that, you develop a lot of wherewithal and understanding of what a well should and shouldn't be like. And so find out what they recommend, and fix it if you can. So the other issue is abandoned wells. You buy a property out in the country, it's got this nice house on it. There may be 3 wells there, you just don't know it. The original well from the 1800s, some other old dug well, and then the well that's there now that everybody's using. Because well logs weren't required in most states, and in some states they still aren't, until the 60s to the 80s, there's typically more wells that are out there that we don't know about than that we have a log for. And Illinois was kind of a leader in that, to be honest. We started requiring well logs and licensing drillers and requiring permits for wells in 1968. We have about 500,000 well logs in our files, but we think there's close to 1 million, or about 800,000 or so that are actually still in use. So we just don't have logs for the rest of them. I did a research project to identify how many wells might be impacted by a large municipal water supply if it went into this certain aquifer in central Illinois. And as part of that, we hired 5 geology students for over the summer to go door to door and find out if someone had a private well, how deep it was, where the pump was set, so we could make a determination about what the risk was of their well going dry or their pump going dry. And we found 1,780 some wells, and we only had logs, or we didn't have logs for 788 of them. And so you compare that with other states that was way into the 80s, or in like New York, it was 2000 before they passed a law requiring logs to be filed. You know, they probably have well logs in New York for maybe 10 to 20% of the wells that are actually in use there. So the whole point of that was that if there's likely an abandoned well, an old well on a lot of properties, and they're really a risk, not only for your safety or your family's safety, but they're a source of contamination if they're in the same aquifer, or if they're in any aquifer, or if someone walks on your property and falls in and gets killed or gets hurt, you're going to be responsible. So they should really be fixed and sealed. Here's just a couple examples. Again, the 2 pictures both came from the Washington State Department of Ecology's blog. One, there's a horse in the well they're trying to get out, and the other one, a man fell 45 feet into a well and came out unscathed, if you read that story, which is a miracle, but it just happened. And these pictures, or these newspaper clippings, are all from the 90s. And the third one, most people who are old enough will remember when Jessica McClure her rescue, if you will, was covered live on CNN for about 18 hours. And it was, one of the first times that, something like that had been talked about nationally, but it happens a lot. These other 3 papers are all regional papers in Illinois. Folks die when they fall in these wells, and, a lot of times, especially back in the 90s before everything was on Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff, you just didn't hear about it in other places when something like that happened. So it does happen. There are a lot of wells out there. If you have an old a well that needs to be abandoned that's not in use, even if you have a nice cover on it or whatever, the best thing to do is to fill it in, and most states have rules or information on how you should do that. I know some states have, through the soil and water conservation districts, cost share programs. You can contact them where they'll pay for, I know in Illinois, the program they had paid for like up to $750 of the cost to seal an old abandoned well. And I know Iowa has a program like that too through their grants to counties program. So that's what I have as far as what you can do to keep yourself safe. I do want to talk about our class for a little bit, for a few minutes, and then we have a bunch of questions that you all asked that we've got listed here and we're going to go through. So the private well class is a 10-lesson class. The way it's set up, you sign up on our website with an email address, your first name, and what state you live in. And that's really so that we can show RCAP and EPA that that it has national coverage of people from every state. We've had almost 7,000 people take it so far, which is awesome. But there's 17 million private wells out there, so we have a long way to go. When you sign up, it sends you a pretest and a lesson for the first week, and then once a week at the same time, it sends you the next lesson. So for every person that emails us and says once a week is too quick, another person emails us and says once a week isn't fast enough. And so we've left it like that, and it's worked out pretty well. It's between 6 and 10 pages for each lesson, and it's really just information that you can absorb, and hopefully it generates questions, and there's other resources and things like that. But these webinars we're doing are meant to support that, and some of the material you saw here will be in one of the lessons. But it's in a lot more detail. Like, Dan brought up the UL and National Sanitation Foundation and all that stuff. We go into a lot more detail there about how to find those resources. So, and it's the website's privatewellclass.org. In addition, I mentioned the assessment tool earlier that RCAP is using around the country. We helped develop that with a team of folks from around the country that are all well experts. And so, my job with all the RCAP folks is to serve as a resource and provide materials, and so we try to do that. This is the front page of our privatewellclass.org. You click on Learn by Email or Take Our Free Class, and it takes you to a place to sign up. We also have, you can learn by video or audio, and I'll show you those in a second. Under the resource library for each of the 10 lessons, there's a whole series of other documents that we've linked to that help describe the material in that lesson, like Lesson 1, The Science of Groundwater. It's all about the hydrologic cycle and how water moves through the ground and how it recharges. And some of these other documents here, like the 2 by Lyle Raymond from Cornell, those are great documents. He developed those, 30 years ago, and they really are well explained, and they're easy to understand, and they're good material to give you another view if you don't like the way these materials are written. But so there's 10 of these sets of materials available, and we link to their pages, and so that make that stuff available to everybody. We also record these webinars, like today's webinar is being recorded, and it'll be on our YouTube channel and in our video training videos page or webinar recordings page. And so we do webinars on specific topics, like we did one in August on just about lead, and we brought in an expert on lead from Virginia Tech who did a lot of the presentation. We do one every July on septic systems. We've done one the last couple of years for labs, and we do some for environmental health professionals. So there's these things will always be available. If for folks who couldn't make it today, for instance, they can always listen to this on their own time through our website. And then we also have created some pages that provide additional information, like for lead. We have one for realtors, and we have one for labs, just with targeted information that helps them understand other resources and what the federal government's looking at as far as lead and all that stuff. So again, our job is to provide the material and be the facilitator to get information in people's hands. But they, as long as they're interested, it's all here for you. We've also created a number of training videos like this one. What should I know about a shared well? It's actually a lot bigger issue than most people realize. You have 4 homes. A contractor came in and put in these 4 homes and only put in 1 well. The well's only on one of those people's property. If it's not in the deed or in some kind of written contract that they'll share the well, maybe the first 4 people who live there are all friendly and nice, but you get that one person who moves in and they own the well, they may not decide they want to share it with anybody anymore. So you need to, there's just a lot of those things that actually happen. I can't tell you how many people have called me and said, I share this well and their son's going to move in and he said he's not going to let us use the water anymore. Or, there's just a lot of cases where things happen. Or, they start arguing about it needs a new pump and it's $3,000. Who's going to pay for that? And so this video helped explain some of those issues. And, why does my well keep losing pressure, or how does my pressure tank work? We have a video called How's My Pressure Tank Work? I think it's probably the most popular one we have, and it's had over 200,000 hits. It's amazing. A lot of folks on private water systems don't have good pressure, and they don't necessarily understand why or understand how that works. And so it walks through, how to set your pressure switch and, what all the pieces do so that you can understand what might be going wrong if there's a problem and things like that. We have a number of podcasts for the first 3 lessons, and then some of the interviews we've done for RFD Radio in Illinois, which is the Farm Bureau network, on different issues, abandoned wells, and things like that. So if you're into podcasts, I know we've had, I think, nearly 3,000 downloads of these, which, I'm older. I'll admit it. I don't really listen to podcasts, but it seems to be pretty popular, so it was a good idea. We've also created a completely Spanish version of our website. Now, not every video and set of materials available, but you can take the class, and there's probably 6 or 8 of those help videos that are on there as well that are in Spanish. And we've done 2 or 3 Spanish language webinars, and they're also recorded and available on this site. So especially if you're a health professional and you're in an area where there are a lot of Spanish-speaking or first Spanish-speaking families on private wells, this is a resource you can point them to. Yeah. So the goal of our program is really to help well owners understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, and how they can use that information to help protect themselves from risk. And so, today's just a short snapshot of what's available, and we would certainly recommend that you sign up for the class. We think it's worthwhile, and it's material you can always have. It's 10 PDFs that you'll be able to keep and look to whenever you need to, but don't sign up for the class just to download the material. It's worth going through, and you really should each week. Make yourself do it because it's really worthwhile. So we did get a lot of questions. I want to say around 80 that we can't answer all those today, but we will answer a fair number of them. And again, if you come up with a question and we've already got a number, it looks like we've got 5 of them so far that people have asked today. We'll get to those at the end. And so currently, we are developing a web page of a lot of the questions we've gotten, hundreds of questions, and it's just taken longer than we thought to get that up online. But we'll just get to the questions. And Dan's going to help me. Again, as I mentioned, he'll answer a lot of the questions that are related to water quality. And so first thing we get a lot is about disinfecting a well. And this time, it's all in different forms. I just had a guy tell me the other day that he puts a cup of bleach down his well every month. And, that does nothing to disinfect your well. And it's really a bad idea. So how often should I shock my well, and what's the best way to do so? And this is a question we got this time. One, you should only disinfect your well when it needs it, which means you've sampled and you know that there's bacteria there. Otherwise, there's no reason to disinfect your well. Adding a little chlorine doesn't help. You need to follow the right protocol. When you need to disinfect your well, you don't put straight bleach down your well. There's a lot of things you need to follow. You need to make sure that every line in your house has chlorinated water in it. So that means you have to flush every toilet, turn on every shower, turn on every faucet until you smell chlorine, then shut it off and let it sit overnight. And if you don't do that, you're not getting chlorine to kill bacteria that may not be in your well. Most of the time it's in something else. It's in your water line. It's in one of your pipes. And so Minnesota Department of Public Health has this really great guide on how to disinfect your well. We looked at probably, I say 70, 80, probably more than that, different brochures, pamphlets, guides on how to disinfect your well, and we think this is the best one. And so this is the one we recommend to people. And you can find it. I showed you those resources earlier for lesson 1 and 2. If you go down to lesson 10 on that resource library page, under lesson 10, which is called Water Treatment Solutions, you can find this document and click on it and download it. And it's freely available. And it walks you through how to disinfect your well. Like, you don't mix chlorine straight because, especially if you have a pitless adapter or rubber seals, that straight chlorine can ruin those quickly. So by using straight chlorine instead of mixing it to a concentration that's needed, you are risking that happening. Also, chlorine is an oxidant. So in a bedrock aquifer, if there's metals in the bedrock, which happens a lot, you can release those all in mass. And so pouring a lot of chlorine, straight chlorine down your well can lead to oxidizing a lot of lead or arsenic or other things that you don't want to come up in your well water. So we recommend following their guidelines, and you need to know a few things. You need to know the diameter of your well and how deep it is. That's really two of the biggest pieces there, and so you know how much to mix up. And it even talks about what to do with water softeners and your water treatment equipment. They recommend here that you go to WQA.org, which is the Water Quality Association. They represent all the companies that make treatment equipment, and they provide a lot of resources there to help get to their guidelines and things like that. So a little bit more about disinfection. Dan, I'm going to let you answer this, so I'll read the question. Testing shows my well is free of bacteria, but in my house I still have positive bacteria results. Something in the house filter softener is causing the problem? ?
Sure, I can try to answer that. I think Steve did a good summary just on the previous slide about a lot of things that are covered here. And the Water Quality Association website, it looks like they had information about how to disinfect softeners, but probably the biggest point to make here is make sure all the surfaces of your internal plumbing have been covered. I hear from people, I don't know, a fair amount, where they say, oh, I had somebody disinfect my well and they just dropped a pellet of bleach down in the well and that was it, and then let it sit and didn't really flush it through the lines. So it's important to, a lot of times the instructions will have you flush the water up and maybe into your well itself, rinse down the lines of your well, and at that time you can smell it to see if it's like connected to an outside tap or something, and you can smell it to make sure you have enough chlorine. One demo I went to, they followed all the directions, but they couldn't smell chlorine, so the advice was to add a little bit more chlorine because there must be something reacting with chlorine and tying it up. But in general, if your well is free and it's something in your house, you might look into your treatment devices. And the Water Quality Association website has if you search for like disinfecting water after a flood, I think they do cover some various devices and advice on how to deal with those devices. I should emphasize though that probably the most important thing just to cover yourselves is check with your water treatment dealer. You don't want to do something that's going to ruin your device. And I think these instructions were on the previous slide too, but a lot of times I've seen add about a half a cup of bleach to your brine tank and then run it through a regeneration cycle immediately. Softeners are pretty common. There's some other advice for other devices too, but this is the general thing is to get chlorine to touch every surface.
Yeah. So cisterns came up a couple times, which isn't very typical, honestly. We do know there's a lot of cisterns out there in areas where there's not much groundwater. We have an area in southern Illinois that's that way actually, and there's a lot of dug wells or cisterns, or they're using tanks. So I have a cistern, so my water supply comes off the metal roof. Recommendations for keeping it safe. So again, realize that folks who have cisterns typically do that because there's no other choice. It's not, it's surface water. It's coming off of a roof. So it's not really recommended for a potable water supply, but again, sometimes you don't have a choice. The other more, quote, vulnerable areas are where you have springs, which also happen in all over the country really, but concentrated in Tennessee, Kentucky, southern Indiana, Illinois, a lot of karst and a lot of springs, and so or other vulnerable geologies like karst, as I mentioned here. So it's much more likely to have bacterial contamination because it's much more likely that surface infiltration is becoming part of the groundwater system. So the best way to ensure that is with frequent testing and then continuous disinfection. Matter of fact, for like a spring or a cistern, that really is the recommendation. You should be using continuous disinfection, and whether that's a chlorinator, and not one of those things that drops pellets in your well, but it's something that is in your line, and make sure you have a residual or a UV unit. Either of those things, they've really come down in price, and UV for springs, especially like in Tennessee, I know there's a lot of them in use. So, and the way to look at this, and just to be clear, do birds ever sit on your roof? And if so, think about that's always going to get into your cistern, and so you're always going to have a chance of bacterial contamination basically any day, and that means you need to have both a filter and continuous disinfection. And yeah, the chlorination and cleaning of the cistern itself once in a while to make sure that that's kept, doesn't become the source of your contamination. And I know I have another slide on this because Dan had provided some stuff, and I want to give him a chance to talk. Yeah, Dan found the following information. Any thoughts, Dan? Anything else?
Yeah, that was a good summary, Steve. I think these sources say some of the things that you said there, that if you have a cistern, some people will have them, and I think some of the advice in some of these sources will be, if you have any other source of drinking water, but you insist on a cistern, maybe use the cistern for like watering a garden or something. It's sort of a last resort for drinking water. But if you do use it for drinking water, there are things you need to be aware of, like like Steve just mentioned, disinfecting the tank first. I think that's covered in some of these. And generally, they'll say one of the CDC links. Basically, you want to always have a chlorine residual present in the water. So I think this is a pretty decent recommendation here. 0.2 to 2 parts per million of chlorine is it seems like it's pretty common to see that recommendation. So you can find more information from these links.
And just on the residual issue, a community water supply is required by law to maintain a chlorine residual in their disinfection. In their distribution system, so that the last house on the line is still getting water that the distribution piping can't grow bacteria and cause a problem. So these things are well tested for community water supplies. It's just well owners for private wells have always been on their own, and it hasn't been on anybody's radar. So a lot of these things are just now really being dealt with. Karst geology. So one of the questions we got for this webinar was, I had a scientist tell me that he never drinks untreated water in a karst area. How should those of us in karst areas deal with our private wells? Well, and my boss, who runs the groundwater section here, is a karst expert. He's a geochemist and has done a lot of work in southern Illinois looking at all the karst issues, and he actually answered this question. I'm just going to read it basically. He's right. Karst is typically associated with sinkholes, caves, and surface contamination. It's very vulnerable to surface contamination. So bacteria is almost always going to be a concern. We have a county, Pike County in Illinois, where their county health department has about 80% of the private well samples they do come back positive for coliform E. coli. So it really is a risk, and it's because if you've ever been in an area like that, you see these sinkholes, it's just the dissolution of dolomite bedrock. Eventually that's how caves are formed and all that stuff. Well, some of those are at the surface, and so there's a direct conduit. So every time there's a heavy rainstorm or a big snow melt, you get this flush of water through there that includes everything from all the pastures and cattle and everything else. Matter of fact, I know he's done some work working with some other professors on campus looking at ways to determine what kind of E. coli it is, whether it came from a human, a horse, a cow, or pig, or whatever. And so that's how sophisticated things are getting. Yeah, but it's just, if you're in one of those areas, you certainly probably should use continuous disinfection. And if you're drilling a new well, one thing to consider, one is, like in Pike County now, a lot of that area is under a rural water district where they've ran piping for a community water supply all through the country in the area, and there just aren't very many people on private wells these days. But if you are going to put in a private well in a karst area, put the casing down as far as you can, and hopefully you get past maybe the karst dolomite into something else that may be more solid, more like a traditional bedrock, and having that casing there, so the water has to come in below it, will help, hopefully help from any kind of surface problems. It's still just not a great idea. So UV for disinfection. Yeah, is ultraviolet light an effective way to eliminate bacteria from well water? And, the short answer is it certainly is, and we've already talked about it some, but UV does kill things, and they're becoming more common. I know working with some folks in Tennessee and Southern Illinois that you see a lot more of these used for private use these days, and they're prevalent in areas, again, like karst areas or where there's springs. And so they, some people don't like the taste of chlorine, or they're worried about, disinfection byproducts from chlorine, and so UV is a way. One thing that I should have put on here and I didn't is that the important thing is, and Dan talks about this all the time, he's like, if you're going to have any kind of treatment, you should have a filter first, because a lot of times the dissolved or the solids or whatever in well water, or coming from the well or coming from the piping or whatever, can foul these type of units. And so if you're going to use UV, there's two things you have to do. One, you need to make sure the water has been filtered so that it's not being fouled, or the light can't get through because the water isn't clear. And two, you need to maintain it. If no treatment equipment is worth anything if you're not maintaining it and following the directions that you're supposed to. If it's a filter, you got to replace it when it needs to. If it's an RO, all those things have to be done correctly. And so, yeah, it's really important. So lately I've noticed green algae in our initial water filter. What does that mean? Dan?
Yeah, we've gotten this question a couple times, and I don't really get it too often in our public service lab, but generally algae needs sunlight to live. So the groundwater is underground where there's not sunlight, so it shouldn't typically be in wells. So if you do have algae, it probably means, or it seems like it should mean, that your source of your well water is from a nearby pond or a lake or a stream. There's some kind of a connection there. If I did have that, probably you're going to have not just algae but other bacteria and surface water issues, so you're probably going to end up having to install a continuous disinfection, like a continuous chlorinator or a UV system or something like that.
Yeah, and we got this question once before, and it was a guy who had tested his filter and found that it was algae. And then as we talked to him about that, found out that his well was about 15 feet from a lake. And so, he's pulling lake water in that case. And so, yeah, any surface water body you're getting your water from is going to be heavily contaminated with bacteria. So it's always an issue to consider. Water softener. So someone asked, how can I determine if my water softening system is working correctly?
Yeah, I can take that, Steve, if you want.
Question for you.
Sure. Yeah, this is a pretty common question because a lot of people on well water will have a softener. Not that you have to have a softener, but if you do have a softener and you want to know if it's working correctly, it's an easy water test. You can submit it to a lab, like Steve mentioned before about the different sources of labs. What they're most likely going to test for is calcium and magnesium. Those are the two elements that make up the hardness calculation. Typically, there's some other methods, but it's too much to get into here. And the minerals that make up hardness primarily are calcium and magnesium. And you can go to any lab, but if you want to do it yourself, there are some test strips out there that you'll find at pet stores, pool stores, hardware stores, and they'll give you a rough idea. Down below, we have an analysis to show you kind of what you would expect from a softener. I think Steve covered some of this a little bit earlier, but this is a sample from 92. It's just a pretty easy to read example here. This customer had a fair amount of iron in there. That 4 parts per million of iron, or almost 5 parts per million of irons, will cause a significant amount of staining, and that's, honestly, that's really a lot of the questions we get here in our lab is, how can I deal with the iron? People are also concerned with the hardness and the scale that comes with that, and those are caused by these calcium and magnesium minerals. What a softener will do is it'll exchange, it's an ion exchange process, it'll exchange those ions for sodium. You'll typically use sodium chloride for your regeneration solution, and that'll replenish the sodium on the resin. And so you'll see on the right-hand side there, the iron, manganese, calcium, magnesium are all reduced, and sodium is increased. It'll also take out a few other metals. It's not designed to take out every metal. Some of the metals like arsenic are exist in an oxide form, so it's a different charge. But anyway, this gives a good example of what you might expect from a softener and how you can test for it.
Yeah, and I didn't even think about that, but we looked at Dan's data. This was 15 years ago when the arsenic rule changed. We looked at a lot of the data they had from the lab, where they've collected a sample before any kind of treatment and after, and we had a number of I think we had about 70 different results where we had a before treatment and after treatment with just a softener that had arsenic at a measurable amount. And it turned out for those 70 samples that the softener took out about 40% on average of the arsenic. You can't count on that, though. In some cases, it took out almost 100%, and some it took out almost none. But so, yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting, Stephen. I had forgotten about that. Thanks for mentioning it. My suspicion about what's going on there, you'll see in arsenic discussions, you'll see people talk about it absorbing to iron or having some type of iron-based adsorptive media that's the basis for removing some of this. So I think the common theory is that it will co-precipitate with iron.
Yes.
And so, yeah. So.
Yep. Yeah, it's still pretty interesting that you can, a little more bang for your buck, if you will.
Yeah,
So,
and like Steve said, you don't want to count on that. Yeah, anyway.
Cool. Okay. Arsenic in wells, does it change? How often to test? Earthquakes, what to look for after? I guess there's really 2 questions, but we answered them both. So arsenic is a naturally occurring contaminant, and, it doesn't occur in every state. But when I work with some of the state agencies that regulate public water supplies, there are a number who say we don't have any issues with arsenic in our state. But, it's pretty common. It's the 7th most common element in Earth's crust. So the first thing to do is to contact your health department or your resource agency in your state to ask if they know if there's arsenic in the groundwater in your area. Like I mentioned before, we can tell you where there is and isn't arsenic in groundwater in Illinois, which counties have, an aquifer that's either sand and gravel or bedrock aquifer that does, and a lot of them don't. It's in certain areas. So the first thing is to find out, whether or not it might be there. It doesn't change, and I think I mentioned that too. If it's in a fairly stable groundwater aquifer, not that's heavily surface influenced, you don't see arsenic values changing that much from sample to sample. So if you have it, you're going to always have it. As the bottom line, it's not going to just disappear because it's traveling through the aquifer. It doesn't really work by that mechanism, so it's part of the source material. And I know one of the aquifers that I've worked in that has a lot of arsenic, it's a sand and gravel aquifer where it's got a lot of grains of pyrite which have arsenic on them. It's called arsenopyrite, and it's just there. It's in the material. Depending on the chemistry of the water, how reducing it is, it might be released into the water or it might stay bound. And so if you're seeing it in your sample, you're going to continue to see it, and you're going to need to treat if you want to do that. So as far as the earthquake question, we don't really have that issue in Illinois, but we have seen in other areas where it's caused a lot of problems with wells. It can change water levels because a well that's cased through multiple aquifers, to get to a certain one, maybe the casing gets cracked. And now, that aquifer can influence the water. So that not only changes maybe a water level, but it can change the chemistry, and or maybe it's near the surface where that's happening. So now the shallow water table that may have more vulnerability to contamination is actually getting into your well. And so, because we even see that, you talk about earthquakes, but we had a case where these folks could not, their well seemed perfectly fine. It was a PVC well that was well sealed at the top. It turned out that they had a 20-inch diameter tree within 2 feet of the well. So the roots had gotten around that casing and eventually squeezed it and cracked it. And so bacteria could get in. So anything like that that could cause your casing to get cracked could be an issue, and you need to test and see if the chemistry's changed. And in theory, if you've already sampled your well before, you have something to compare it with, which is why we say every 3 to 5 years, because it's important to know, like I mentioned, arsenic. If your arsenic sample, you sample every 5 years for arsenic, and it's always been 38 to 42, and then all of a sudden it's less than 3, something's changed and you're getting water from another source. So it's worth sampling again to find out, what's going on. Nitrate. How does nitrate get into well water? How much nitrate is a concern? Is there an inexpensive way to remove it? Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Nitrate is usually attributed, it's usually associated with surface water getting in your well. How much nitrate's a concern? The maximum contaminant level is 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. This would be a good time to point out that you might see nitrate expressed as nitrate, like the anion NO3. It's important to understand these regulations if you're ever looking at nitrogen or phosphorus regulations, that there's a conversion, and there are significant differences between the two. So it's 10 as nitrogen. It's like 45 as nitrate.
It is 45 nitrate, yeah.
Because it's associated with the surface water, I think it's a good idea to go ahead and get a bacteria test done as well. It's not that nitrate is necessarily harmful to adults, they say. It can be an issue for infants, but because it can be an issue for infants, it is considered a health hazard. But also there are other, like we mentioned, I think before, it's kind of a tracer organism or a analyte. So you might have other things getting in your well, so it's a good idea to get tested for bacteria and treat it as necessary. And how do you get rid of it? Reverse osmosis it should be a relatively inexpensive way to remove nitrate and other things, as you saw in the previous example.
Okay. This is also for you. Gray colored water. Water coming out of my faucet has a gray light color. What's causing this? Is the water safe to drink?
Yeah, those kind of questions like gray and brown colors we get those a lot. So it could be a variety of sources. My first thought whenever I hear those kind of questions that it might be iron or manganese. A lot of people will attribute iron to just orange, but I've seen and done some tests on some sediment where it'll be black. Like when it's wet, it'll be black. And it'll be completely iron. When that dries out, it'll be more of a orange color to brown. A lot of times those will mix with maybe some hardness materials, and so it gives it maybe kind of a gray color instead of a dark black. But anyway, the first thing I would do for I think Steve mentioned this earlier in the webinar. These are really cheap to put in. They should cost like maybe $50. A sediment filter is a little cartridge that you can put in right after your pressure tank. That you can they're easy to open. You can change it out every few months, and you can, if you get one with a see-through canister, you can see how much sediment's getting in your water and in your being captured by your filter. That'll protect any downstream water treatment equipment. So I would first get a filter, but you can also get a test on the sediment if you can, or get a test for the water. That's a good place to start. Is get a test for your water, see if anything looks unusual, and take it to your local health department. They should know the water quality in your area, and they should be familiar with anything that's really unusual like that. So get their advice. It's always a good idea to lean on the local health departments for the information related to your areas, basically.
All right. So testing, so other than routine chemical and bacteriological testing, is it prudent to test for VOCs, SOCs, or heavy metals? And, yeah, depending on the lab,
Yeah.
are some part of the routine analysis, but, they're really expensive to test for. And so, as are other organic contaminants. So in general, usually you don't sample for those things unless you have a reason, and there's a potential source, somebody gets sick, some of those things. And so you might want to consider it after consulting with the local health department. Ask them, is there anything in my area, or do you know of anything in your area? Folks that are near gas stations, for instance, sometimes those underground tanks can start leaking and some things like that. We did have and that's my best advice. Again, you should always lean on your health department and ask them about those things. If you know there's a known source, or there's something nearby that may have, caused a problem, or you're near, industrial site, it's those sorts of things you're going to find there. We did have another question about, hey, is it a risk if my truck leaks oil and it's really near my 23-foot deep well? Well, that's a really shallow well. And so it likely gets water from the surface in the well in the first place. And so a well that's that shallow, you need to be testing fairly often. And it certainly could impact the well, depending on how much of a leak you've got there. It's certainly not a place to pour those things out and things like that. So, it's a tough one because, going out and getting a sample for a suite of VOCs and SOCs and things like that, can be more than $1,000, I think, can it, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. If you add up, like maybe an individual test for multiple parameters might be $100 to $150, but then it's not like that one test is going to cover everything. Especially if you start including all the different kinds of pesticides you might worry about. It's really a good idea to see if you're concerned about a pesticide, find out if it's commonly used in your area, and hopefully a local health professional will know the answer to that.
Yeah. All right. So the question was, I've seen driven wells in basements and garages. Should these wells be used for drinking or considered safe if they pass bacteria nitrate tests? Well, the bottom line is we don't recommend that you use, those, I call those sandpoint wells. They're driven by hand. You can go to a hardware store or a farm store sometimes and buy those and put them in, and you can find videos all over the internet about putting those in backwoods areas and things like that. But you're not putting any kind of gravel pack in. You're not putting any kind of anything around the annulus of the well casing to help protect it. So it's just, they're typically put in where there's sandy soil and the water table's high, so you're only driving in maybe 15 or 20 feet at the most, sometimes much less than that. And so typically they're going to be much more vulnerable to contamination. Because there's a lot more, it's so close to the surface and it's sandier soil, and it just allows more infiltration to happen. We see them in Illinois in areas along river bottoms where there's a lot of sandy areas, and there's a lot of people who use them. But there's also a lot of agriculture there, and I guarantee you, if we sample those wells, they're going to have nitrate and pesticides in them. And so, with all that being said, though, if you're sampling regularly, that's kind of our litmus test on whether you should use a well or not. And so you should make sure if you're sampling, I'm not sure that just bacteria and nitrate is enough, but I don't really have a good recommendation on what else to sample for. It kind of depends on where you're at. And so, again, we don't recommend these types of wells because if anything gets spilled or makes its way nearby, or there's a flooding event or whatever, it's just that much more risky because it's so shallow, and it's likely getting surface infiltration. So, and some states don't allow them, some states do. In Illinois, you're allowed to put in your own well, but you have to meet the well construction code if you're going to do that. You don't have to use a licensed driller if it's your property and you're doing it for yourself. But, that doesn't meet our code to put in one of those wells. But in other states, they do allow them. So, yeah. As a good example, there's an aquifer that's heavily irrigated, so there's a lot of infiltration, and the aquifer itself is sand at the surface, and it goes down to bedrock at about 120 feet. There's a lot of sand points out there, but when I talk to anybody who's a well owner out there, they sample and they get high nitrate or they have bacteria or whatever, I tell them they should put their well, put in a sand and gravel well and go all the way to the bottom. Go till they hit bedrock, put the screen right above rock, and then use solid casing from the screen on up, which is how you typically would put in a sand and gravel well. That means any water from the surface has to go down, 115 feet to get to the top of that screen before it can be pulled up by the well. And so, that sand acts as a filter. It provides a little assurance that a lot of the surface contamination isn't going to get down to where you're pulling your water from. And that's the safe thing to do in that situation, at least in my mind. How can I prevent or get rid of sediment in well water? Dan?
Sediment, there can be a number of issues. Steve's probably more familiar with well construction issues, but it can be coming from the well itself. Perhaps the pump is set a little bit too low, like close to the screen. I think they'll say it can churn up more sediment that way. Is that right, Steve?
Yeah. So I was going to answer the first part of this, wasn't I? Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So yeah, if in a sand and gravel well, you don't put your pump down in the screen because it creates too strong of a velocity so that the fines that might be in the formation in the sand and gravel will make their way through the gravel pack and get into your well and cause that kind of sediment. The other thing that can happen in a bedrock well is you may just have sediment in the rock. In a bedrock well, the water's coming from fractures, big fissures in the rock. It's not coming from the rock itself. And so depending on where that water is coming from, it could have a source of sediment. It could even have a crack that runs back up towards the surface. And so in those cases, there's not a lot you can do. You're just going to have sediment. So, and that's leading to where Dan's going with the dissolved stuff too. Yeah,
I've had some experience with water where you'll have iron dissolved in the water. For instance, iron's probably the biggest thing I think about. It'll precipitate out, perhaps before it gets into your pressure tank. I've seen pitless adapters that have been covered with black precipitate from the water, perhaps oxidation of some of the metal, but I suspect it's iron precipitating out. So these things that'll happen as the water gets pulled up and exposed to air and oxidized. So you can that's another reason we mentioned earlier, put a sediment filter for both reasons. It'll get rid of some sediment. If you put a sediment filter in, and you've got iron, for instance, or something else that's going to precipitate, like manganese, you might want to put in a softener or a iron filter if you don't want soft water to help keep that. It's going to oxidize and fall out of solution and cause laundry staining and other things like that.
Yeah. All right. So those are the questions that we answered from all the questions you all asked in advance. And it looks like we have, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up my other screen here and get to the questions. Let me make this a little bit bigger real quick. Okay. Does that look pretty good, Dan?
Yep. Looks good to me.
So first question, how critical is it for a sample to arrive at the lab within 24 to 48 hours if a water sample does not arrive within the specified time? Do labs run the analysis anyway?
I'll try to tackle that. I would say always follow the advice that your labs are giving you. If they're going to, for a lot of parameters, it may not matter if it comes back in time or not, but a lot of times it definitely will matter, especially for bacteria analysis. The water will likely be rejected, and you'll have to resample and resend it in if you don't submit it within the time frame they give. So just the best advice, I don't want to make a generic answer that applies for every lab out there. I would follow their advice and see what their policies are.
Yeah, and even so, my son lives on an old dug well, and I went to our health department in Champaign County to get a kit to sample it, and they made it clear I had to sample the morning I was going to bring the sample in and have it there by noon because they courier it over to the state lab in Springfield that same day. So, it's just, it's a good procedure and good policy. So
yeah, I've had the same kind of experience. That being said, we, some of our analyses we would do go ahead and run the analysis anyway, but I would say that's not the typical policy.
So number 2 is for you too, Dan. We had our well shocked and the basic tests are good, but the cold water, non-softened water in the kitchen sink now has the sulfur smell. Why and what causes this?
Sulfur smells are typically associated with bacteria or hydrogen sulfide and bacteria that generate that hydrogen sulfide. It's a reducing bacteria. I don't think I've quite heard it phrased as it only appeared, or maybe I'm inferring too much from here, like after it was shocked, but only the cold water non-softened has the sulfur smell. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but some things, yeah. A lot of times you'll read about it being caused by growths in the hot water heater or corrosion of the anode rod, but just in the cold water, it could be that the hot water is killing any bacteria, I suppose. In some discussions I've had with some health professionals, if you do have like a sulfur-reducing bacteria problem, or probably any other bacteria problem, they'll say that these things kind of grow in slimy layers, and so you might chlorinate once and you'll kill off one layer, but you might have to chlorinate several times. And that's it, that's assuming it's not going to just be part of the aquifer and just keep coming back. But yeah, I guess I don't have a perfect answer for that question, but
because that's unusual. What they're having happen here. So yeah. Okay. Just now, I mentioned that New Hampshire made the code available for the results for their entry tool. Is that upon request or is it posted in central location? They gave it to the US EPA, who have a repository for it. If you'll email us, I can get you the contact information for the folks in New Hampshire. I know EPA was trying to create a site where other states could use the tool from within this workbench that they've set up online. And so that's one approach if your state doesn't have the resources to create its own from the code. But I know a number of states actually wanted the code itself so they could create their own pages. And the best thing for me to do is get you to the New Hampshire folks, and they can tell you where to go from there. So they developed that with a CDC grant, and they've made it available. It's pretty awesome. I expect by the end of this year there's going to be at least 4 or 5 other states that have one of these tools up. So what sealant can one use? I understand it has to be NSF approved. Sealant.
Yeah, I'm not sure on that one, Steve.
Yeah, can you let us know what you mean by sealant there? Because I'm not sure in what context you mean that, and I apologize. If you could provide a little more information through the question bar, I appreciate it. If you owned a vacation cottage, what filters or water system would you have? Really, they're no different than than a home, other than it's a seasonal system. And I know there's some materials out there about how to start up your system and how to take it offline when you're not going to be there that often. And I don't know, Dan, if you have any other questions.
I'm not sure. Go ahead.
And the problem with these, like if you're only there half the year or whatever, is that water sits stagnant in those lines. And a lot of times that's when bacteria can grow if it's, if there's not already chlorine in there or some of those things. So, and I don't know that, I'm not saying necessarily to run out and do this, but, one recommendation would be to have some kind of continuous disinfection on a thing like that. I know on the community water side or on the non-community side, like for, campgrounds and things like that, where they're only there seasonally, you hear a lot of stories about some of those lines being full of bacteria, or a summer camp or things like that. So,
that's a good answer. That's a good answer, Steve. I think just treat it like a regular house for the specific things you mentioned here. If it's negative for bacteria, I've heard the same thing Steve just mentioned, that as it sits stagnant, you tend to have more of a problem with that. But I guess if you don't, and your primary concern is dissolved solids, hardness, and iron, sulfur, it depends how much you're concerned with it. If it's enough that you don't want the staining there at all, then you could put in the same treatment you would put in like for a house, like a softener or something.
Yeah, and I don't know that it would be any different once it's being used. It's really just
Yeah, yeah.
when you start, you might have some issues.
I guess maybe if the person asking this was interested, if you're looking for like a cheap alternative, I know softeners can get expensive. Reverse osmosis will take a lot of stuff out. The thing is, they're not really designed for most people, are not going to have a whole house unit, first of all. But second of all, you have to, usually they're put in after a softener so that the hardness elements don't follow the membrane and bacteria don't grow in the membrane. I think I'd be worried about that kind of stuff. But they are fairly inexpensive, but I'm not really sure I would recommend just doing that.
Yeah, and if you'd like more information, I know there's a couple of states that have put out like fact sheets that are for their non-community systems. They're regulated by law, and so I'm sure we can. I know we have those. We run another program that's for small systems that are regulated by the EPA as water systems. And I know, like, I believe New Hampshire and Washington State both have a seasonal system guide that, talks about best practices. And I'm not sure it'd be that relevant, but it might have some information in there to help. So just email us and we can get those to you. So as going back to question 4, yeah, I don't know. So if you're talking about sealing your well, when I talk about sealing a well, I'm talking about making sure that, it's got a proper well cap, that it's got a vent tube that has a screen in it, that the casing itself is solid and all the joints are right, the bolts are all tight, so that it's, doesn't have access, water can't leak into it. Really, for most people with a regular drilled well that has, like a red monitor cap on top or just a regular well cap, the biggest problem is there's a rubber seal that goes in there to keep that cap watertight, and no one ever replaces the seal. I've opened wells where that thing is completely brittle, and, if there's a flooding event and the well could be overtopped with water, it's going to leak. And so, no well is, over time, is perfect. And as far as that, but you just want to make sure that I can show you pictures of where, larger things like snakes and rats and stuff can get in a well, and you don't want that either. But I'm not sure. I still don't necessarily know what you mean by sealant, to be honest. If you're, there's 2 states that don't regulate well construction, Alaska and Pennsylvania. And so in those states, you can use any kind of material or whatever you want, but otherwise, there are rules for how you build a well in every other state, and those are what you would want to use as far as making sure that the casing's sealed and things like that. So that's the best I got for that. All right, and if you'll email me, we can have a conversation on the phone about that. I'd be glad to make sure that we're meeting your needs and we're answering the question correctly. So dropping to number 6, what disinfection do you recommend that is EPA approved? I don't know that there is such a thing as EPA approved disinfection for a private well. A community water supply has to meet requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act. They have to disinfect and make sure there's residual in their lines, and there's all kinds of rules. Those can vary a little bit state to state, depending on what the state wants to put into law. But none of the rules that, like the Minnesota document for disinfection that I put up earlier, that's a recommendation. Minnesota has no way to forcing you to do anything. And a well driller, even though they're licensed, if they're going to disinfect your well for you, you're paying someone to come in. It can be done whatever they think's best. I just worked with a well owner here in Illinois who was buying a property, and when the contractor came out to disinfect their well because they did a sample and it came back positive for coliform, he basically just poured bleach down the well. And when the homeowner told me that, I gave him the document and said, take this back to the contractor and say, do this. This is the best way to disinfect this, to shot chlorinate it anyway, with a chance of actually clearing out the lines and getting rid of the bacteria. So, as far as what a community might need to do or disinfection, that's a different animal than what we're talking about here. And I don't know that there are EPA-approved disinfection recommendations. Matter of fact, I'm sure they aren't. The Safe Drinking Water Act actually specifically mentions that those rules don't apply to private wells. So when someone says, the health standard for arsenic is 10 ppb, and the state decides to adopt that, like New Jersey, or if some state decided to adopt that for the private well rules, that's because it's in the Safe Drinking Water Act for community water supplies. It's not a requirement for any public or for any private well to meet those same conditions. It would have to be a separate set of rules that are put together by the EPA. Doesn't regulate private wells at the bottom line, so they don't recommend. They don't have approved recommendations for disinfection for private wells. Okay. From what I know, arsenic is natural, but I've heard that it is man-made or is developed through factories or high-tech facilities and discarded where it seeps into groundwater. Is this true? The last part is really a value judgment on the company as far as whether it gets discarded and gets into the groundwater. But certainly arsenic is made, if you will, or developed from natural arsenic sources and used for a variety of things. It used to be used for pesticides. There are industrial uses for arsenic, but whether that's the whole point of that being discarded and seeps in the groundwater is, likely not true. They have to follow a lot of rules if it's a company that is working with hazardous materials, just like everybody else does. And so, that's my answer.
Yeah, that's a good answer, Steve. I was thinking about exactly how do I answer that, but yeah, good points.
Number 8's for you, Dan. Is there treatment that can be installed to treat sulfur?
I assume probably the question is probably about like sulfur smell in water. I think that if it's always there, the first thing you could try is a shot chlorination, or maybe a couple shot chlorinations, and see if that gets rid of potential bacteria in your well that's causing it. If it's in the your water heater, there's some ways you can try to disinfect your water heater. If it gets, sometimes you'll see advice about taking out the anode rod. You can replace the rods, but I think some of the I don't have a lot of experience with water heater. What really works best for people. I don't have any practical experience. But one thing some of the older advice used to be take out the water heater rod completely, but that's not a good idea because it's there for a reason. It's sacrificial. General treatment for the sulfur, you might need to just add a continuous chlorinator or disinfection. Some people may have like an aerator. It's a gas. It's hydrogen sulfide gas. If you have an aerator and perhaps a holding tank, that might help get rid of it. The best advice I think would be talk to a local water treatment dealer in your area. If you've got sulfur, other people
probably do too.
Probably do too. So they'll have some advice that has been working for the local people there. That's generally true for a lot of the water treatment issues. I like to not act like I'm an expert on every water treatment issue. So I'd like to just refer people to water treatment dealers because they'll have some practical experience.
Locally, yeah.
Locally, yeah.
I know most of the time it's attributed to bacteria, but my brother-in-law, lives up in northwestern Illinois in an area where their bedrock water just has a lot of sulfur in it.
Yeah, I think I've heard that too, and I don't know. I was always kind of wondering, is it there's always a bacteria there, but I know it's basically, if it's a continuous source, whether or not it's due to bacteria or just naturally in the water, you're not going to get by with a shot chlorination will oxidize the hydrogen sulfide initially, but it won't get rid of it if it keeps coming back.
Yeah. So, okay. So number 9 here. So Brianna from the Water Quality Association is on our webinar. Thanks for joining us. And so she's provided here a URL to find products, and those are certified water treatment products that they list. And she also listed the NSF one. And if anybody emails us, if you don't have time to write that down or type it out, email us and we'll send you those links Thank you very much. We probably should have provided those. So, um,
While we're on that, if
go
anybody's
ahead.
in, I did have pulled up the, it's probably not the largest concern, but the Water Quality Association link for the, they have the drinking water after a flood. You can probably just search for drinking water or disinfecting drinking water after a flood PDF, and that's looks like they've got some nice description about various drinking water devices, about how to disinfect things.
Great. Okay, so thanks everyone for hanging around, and I'll leave this note up, but that's what we have for today. We had about 120 people on today, I think, and 86 of you stayed, and I really appreciate that. I know we went long. Hopefully this was helpful to you. And again, if you have any questions or any follow-up, feel free to email us. And yeah, we appreciate everybody's time. So thanks, Dan. Thanks, Katie. And everyone have a great rest of your week. All right, take care.
Thanks, Steve.
Yep, thank you.